Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Katsouleas, the Provost at University of Virginia, and I'd like to welcome everyone today to the third session of the Women's Global Leadership Forum, hosted by the University of Virginia as part of our bicentennial celebration. This session, entitled Economic Mobility and Equity for Women, will wrestle with issues at the very core of the ability of women to assume a fair and just role in 21st century democracies around the world. We have with us two remarkable leaders to help frame the conversation. Halla Tómasdóttir has a wealth of experience in both the corporate sector and the world of politics. After serving as the first woman CEO of the Iceland Chamber of Commerce, Halla co-founded an investment firm in 2007 with the goal of integrating feminist values into the world of finance. The firm made global headlines when it survived Iceland's devastating economic collapse. Last year, Halla made history again as candidate for president of Iceland. She entered the race at 1% in the polls. When the final ballots were counted, she was the runner-up in a 9-person contest. What could be next? Halla has her own special connection to the University of Virginia as a former trustee of the Leifur Eriksson Foundation, a graduate fellowship program administered by the UVA Foundation. So she's been here many times for foundation meetings. Welcome home. Our second speaker is Rick Goings, the chairman and CEO of Tupperware Brands, a prominent U.S. corporation with a household name and a multi-billion-dollar portfolio. As testimony to the important issues of economic equity, Mr. Goings served as steward of the World Economic Forum's Education, Gender, and Work Initiative. Rick is one of the 10 founding members of the UN Women's Private Sector Leadership Advisory Council, whose stated goal is to advance women's rights and empowerment. Our moderator is Megan Beyer, and the founder of Sister Republics, a U.S.-Swiss women's leaders project which reported on workplace gender issues in Switzerland. Back in the United States, she served as the external relations representative for Edge Gender Certification, a Swiss firm that certifies companies reaching a global standard in gender equality. Megan recently completed a White House assignment as Executive Director of the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities. Megan is also a frequent guest lecturer for the Young African Leaders Program at Morven here in Charlottesville. We are fortunate to have with us such global thought leaders to address a critical topic. Halla, would you mind starting us off?
Not at all.
Megan, would you mind starting us off?
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
And, you know, this is the good news, the panelists. But for global women's achievement, this is sort of a watershed year. It's not very good news. Because 11 years ago, the World Economic Forum started to use all this great data and technology that we have in the world and came up with SAR and gender equality in countries across the world. 144 education, what we talked about in the last panel, and in economics and politics, I would argue the real power pieces of the puzzle. And for the first time in 11 years, the World Economic Forum had to report that women's equality is going backwards, not forwards, in the entire time they've done this study. So what a downer I am. But the first year it came out, 11 years ago, I remember looking up America and thinking, oh, we're going to do really well. Well, we were in the top 25 for the first couple of years. And this year we're 49. So I think technology and data is telling us what our intuition might have already told us. But the good news is we have two panelists here who represent change agents in women's equality and gender equality. We have one from each gender. Dr. Pinn will be happy to hear that. And we know that with the programs we're going to be hearing about these 3 days, with the sense of activism in this room, that we are able to change. And through this panel, I hope we'll get some good ideas on how to change. So first I want to give a decent introduction to Halla Tómasdóttir, who you heard her story of just suddenly deciding she's going to run for president. She had already very much shown herself to be a leader in the economy and in education in Iceland and around the world. And she went very far in a very short period of time. But she has been cited as one of the women leaders in the global scene. The New Yorker calls her a live emoji of sincerity. So Halla, tell us your story. Tell us how you decided and why you decided to run for president.
Well, thank you. This is, of course, a hard one to follow, but let's be sincere. I really believe in that. I was called a living emoji of sincerity, and in all sincerity, I didn't know what an emoji was. My kids had to explain that to me when this appeared in a New Yorker article right after the elections in Iceland. But for me, the story is very personal of why I do what I do. And I am so lucky to be born in a country that is #1 in closing the gender gap and has been for 8 years running. And that didn't come about easily. So it took a lot of hard work from the women who came before me. And I always share this story, so I'm going to do that today. And if those of you who've seen my TED Talk may be tired of that story, or you may have heard it from lots of places now because it's become quite famous. But that's the story of when I was 7 years old and women in Iceland decided to go on strike. It happened to be on my mom's birthday, so it was October 24th, 1975, and all women decided to do no work that day, whether they held professional jobs or worked at home. And what happened? They brought the country to its knees. Nothing worked in Iceland that day, because nothing works when women are not at work. And so I am so lucky, I'm so grateful for these women who had the courage and the solidarity to pave the way. And it's taken this time, so for the last 9 years we've been #1 in the world, but it started in '75 with the courage of these women. And 5 years later, Iceland was the first country in the world to democratically elect a woman as president. And I believe it happened because of what these women did before. Now, fast forward, we've done a lot of different things in Iceland to get us into this position, and part of that journey has definitely been including men. And thinking not just about this as a women's movement, but as a movement towards a stronger economy and towards social progress and social cohesion. We still have work to do. I'm still at it because of that, but we've gone there because of the women who came before me.
And I am so glad that you brought up men, because it really is in all of our interests to have this gender equality. The World Economic Forum has shown that just on one metric that they look at, if we just got women up to the same economic participation as men globally, by 2025, we would increase the global GDP by $5.3 billion. So clearly it is an imperative for the world. So that's a wonderful segue into our next panelist. Rick Goings is really a internationally known feminist. I mean, he was one of the people who began this he for she movement at UN Women. And he has been working at the World Economic Forum to make sure that this data that you'll find actually in your program is available every year, and that we get down to the bottom line. What does this mean for our society if we don't have gender equality, and who's doing the best job? Rick, how did this become such a passion for you?
Well, it started firstly, I was thrown into a business situation. I became president of Avon, and I believe in steward leadership, and so all of a sudden, I'm working for 3 million women, and that was my job, to really improve their opportunity. And then 25 years ago, I went to Tupperware, and I've been CEO there. I think I'm the second longest serving public CEO. I am happy to report that our president and COO is a woman. I hope to be able to name her CEO next year. And interesting, I was reading in one of your brochures here about Women First. The first woman ever on the cover of Business Week was Brownie Wise in the mid-50s selling Tupperware. So I initially got involved, and then I became infected with that. It started out with the social justice reason that this is not fair. And I am pleased to say I have moved beyond that. And as a matter of fact, one of the big points I keep making is stop talking about the social justice piece because what you do is you make victims of women. I said, talk about the opportunity piece of this, because that is really the power behind it. So, became outspoken at Davos a dozen years ago. I never will forget, I thought I would tell my wife Susan, I said, I was on one of the TV broadcasts across the world complaining that there wasn't a single discussion on women's issues a dozen years ago in Davos. And I said, Klaus is never going to invite me back again. There were more than a dozen this last year now. Now, it's one of the 10 initiatives. So I'm impatient and I'm an activist on it. And perhaps what we can talk about today is some of the ways we can move this forward. Because it still is, the range is between 88 years and 120 years before gender parity is going to be achieved at its current rate. And so I think one of the things we need to also do is we make the mistake of it in this country particularly. I mean, America has a wonderful culture, but an arrogant culture. And you see this in Western Europe. So you see the gender parity issues in this country. Clearly, I believe in glass ceilings and boards. Hey, 50% of our board are women. 44% of our officers are women. But when you get outside the US, which is 5% of the world's population, in Europe, ditto, almost all the women in the world live in these other countries who aren't like Iceland. And her basic challenge is not a seat at the boardroom table, it's a seat in the classroom, or not getting raped before she walks home from her village. I mean, so we have chosen to, we've got to bifurcate this, and when we really deal with women's issues, we've got to start talking about in which markets and what are the issues.
And I think, Halla, because you moved from business to politics, was there something in what Rick is saying now that led you to believe that having women in leadership would address some of these social issues, some of these issues in society that may not be in our immediate sphere?
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with Rick that the situation varies a great deal, and I spend a lot of my time now trying to inspire and empower and hopefully equip women and men to embrace this issue, because it is an equity issue, but it is definitely an economic and social progress issue. And I honestly don't think we'll be around if I think the latest report says 216 years before we close the gender gap, because we went backwards. And that's just not okay. And I don't think any of us can be responsible and leave a world like that for our children. So in my opinion, it's both. We need to work at the grassroots level. We need to do all of the things we heard this morning. It's about education. It's about safety and security for women and the respect that we don't have in so many countries. But it's also about changing the power balance in the world and changing how we do power. And so if you think about October 24th, when these women gathered and refused to do work at home and at work, they went to downtown. There were demonstrations, but there was no violence. It was peaceful. It was a different way of doing power. So I am a big proponent of getting to gender balance in the boardroom and in positions of power, and particularly in terms of heads of states, because we get together, whether it's in Davos or at the G20 or anywhere where we discuss climate change, changing technologies, peace, and it is mostly men talking with men.
Has any other country done this before?
It is.
It is.
Has any other country done this before? Have the women, the Lysistrata approach where women say, I'm out?
Well, in a way, the women's marches here, I believe, in the US were partly inspired by the strike in Iceland, and it's gotten a lot of recognition as of late. But I think that was the right thing to do at the time, and it accelerated speed, and there might be I've seen boycotts. I've seen, certain cities and states and countries say, let's not buy any products from companies that don't do gender balance or don't do social responsibility or sustainability. So there's different ways that activism is actually bringing this about. But to me, it's just, why would any leader not want to tap into all the available talent to address the complicated complicated issues we have to solve in this world. Why?
Now,
Yeah,
Vic, in
spot on.
2012, you had that big report from Credit Suisse, a longitudinal study, 2,400 companies. Bottom line was, on every economic metric, you did better if you had women in leadership. What do you sense when, you're one of the guys at WEF, so you're probably hearing more than I am when I'm there. But, I mean, is there a sense among CEOs that, this is an opportunity and we're missing out? I mean, has that gotten through?
It's beginning to change, but I often talk about, you've got two different, firstly, 94% of all the CEOs of big companies are men. The bulk of all heads of state are men. Yeah. The heads of most universities are men. I know this was first here. So that's why we created at the UN, he for she, because we said, if you're going to leverage influence, you better get him in front of the parade. I very much support all the she for she movements, but if she isn't controlling the company, the state, or the university, it's harder to have leverage. So you look at it as pure strategic approaches, go for leverage.
So tell me
and
what you
that's
do.
the problem in Davos. Davos, 15% of the people that come, and you and I know this, you were telling me that 15% of the people that come to Davos are women. Remember what they did? Comment on what?
A few years ago at Davos, they decided, well, we are going to put together some kind of quota so that if you're bringing 5 people, one of them has to be a woman. And they sent a very stern letter to all these companies, you have to bring a woman. So Rick and I can only deduce that people started bringing 4 people instead of 5, because
and it's still 15%. Yeah, but that's what you had. Back to your question again. You have 2 categories of he's on this. You have those that, and you find this with regard to any kind of cause related, they check the box. I'm doing it. I'm doing performance reviews. But then you get groups that they really do believe this. They understand that even if they don't care about the social justice side of it, they say, well, this is business opportunity, and let's focus on self-interest.
Well, I wonder how much the whole competitive spirit might help. Have you heard of the 30% Club? I'm sure you have.
Yes.
Tell us how that has worked. And I know it's worked a little better in Europe than it's worked here, I think.
Yeah, and I think 30% Club is basically a voluntary organization that's about CEOs and chairmen coming together and volunteering to get at least 30% women into the boardroom. And it's primarily from the UK. But I'm more familiar with the story, and I would rather share the story perhaps of what we did in Iceland. I don't know if you know, but Norway was the first country to introduce a gender quota in the boardroom. And then shortly thereafter, we did so in Iceland. And I was actually part of that movement. And what we decided to do, which after the fact was kind of a clever way to do it, is we came to sort of about progressive companies, so let's get it done. And I was lucky enough to be in a leadership position with a lot of the male leaders at the time, and I asked, how long do you need, speaking of competition? And I said, do you need 10 years? And they looked at me, no, you're fast, you probably can do it faster. And I allowed them to eventually tell themselves and the world in a news conference that they could get there in 5 years. And we went from 12% women in the boardroom to 25% in those 5 years. But right before we signed that publicly, we agreed that if we couldn't get to true balance, which we defined as 40%, either gender, because often you're not in even numbers in the boardroom, we would get gender quota law passed. So 2013 we did. And the interesting part about this experience from my country is that before we passed the gender quota, 2/3 of women directors liked it, but less than half of the male directors liked it. After it was in place for only 2 years, 2/3 of male directors like it, and 90% of female directors like it. So the experience has been overwhelmingly positive.
Try it, you'll like it.
Because inclusive boardrooms, inclusive boardrooms, they work better, not just for women, they work better for all of us. All of a sudden, men came to the board meetings better prepared, I'm not kidding, and so they improved their performance, and that the research shows that, and also the dialogue changed, and we were no longer just talking about the balance sheets or the income statement, we were talking about our responsibility to the world, social responsibility, things like environmental impact, things that really do matter. The bottom line became bigger when both women and men sat around the table.
What is your response to that?
Amen. Great, and I'm a Buddhist. And I've got to say on this thing, because I've had some tension over the last couple of years with a number of board members on this whole statement, shareholder value. And I have fought it. And I've got to say, I'm proud of our performance since we've been a public company, but it's stakeholder value. It's, there are, you've got a young professor here, Halla, we were talking about, it's these two bottom lines. You can make the world a better place by doing this. And I'll tell you where it's really incumbent upon us to make these changes. Millennials today care more about it. I mean, we went from autocratic leadership styles to next styles were rules-based. I mean, that was the United Airlines deal of get him out of his seat, this is the rule. To now, heart is part of it, and it is connecting with people. And frankly, you've got to do these kinds of things if you're going to attract, engage, and retain those kinds of people. Let me tell you a sidebar story.
Okay.
One of our biggest countries in the world is Indonesia. Fourth largest population in the world. Largest Muslim population in the world. You can change men's attitude if you share it with them in a non-defensive way. We had a big meeting and I had all of our women distributors come, but for her to come, and we have women that are making $1 million, $1.5 million US per year, very successful, okay? She had to bring her husband. And I don't speak Bahasa. I sat on the edge of a stage on the stairs. I had simultaneous translation, and I did 90 minutes with slides of the difference between men and women, and I had fun with it with them. It started out with a man's brain, a woman's brain, and here's a man's brain, and we talked about how many more cells, and it was bigger. And then you could see them sitting up, and then I said, however, she scores 4% higher on all IQ tests. And then I started to take apart the brain. Corpus callosum, she's got 30% more. She can multitask. He can't. Talk to him sometimes when he's watching television. He doesn't answer you because he can't hear. I went through this in a fun, really non-confrontational way. That company, over 7 years, 35% compound annual growth. And I saw him move from being really non-supportive to carrying her luggage. I mean, it was just a change. And that's why education is so much a part of this, that there's something in it for you if you understand the power of women.
And so it takes change makers like you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And Dr. Penn was so right. I mean, you are in the power structure as a birthright. And thank you for doing what you've done. Do you have a great mother or children, or you obviously have a great wife? I've met her. But I mean, how come you are the outlier here?
I do think I had I'm Austrian by that. This was a hug by my mom. I said, Mom, that doesn't even feel good. I had a mom that I knew was strong. Nobody crumbled. And so I was raised with that kind of an environment. And I'm funny, there's a lot of guys out there, though. The leaders right now are in touch with the heart leaders today. Yeah, I can be tough. I'm ex-military. I know how to do this, okay? But to keep people together, you just need to be able to not only communicate with their heads, but with their hearts. And there's a lot of people interested in doing this. It's interesting. I have a friend who's the new chairman of PricewaterhouseCoopers, Bob Moritz. And he's a guy that's now getting in front of this. He's one of these 10, he for she. And Bob's not doing it because it's check the box. He's doing it because he says, look, our best candidates out there are women, and I need to get better at this and even sensitize myself more. So that's where I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I was always hopeful after all those studies came out, McKinsey, Bain, Credit Suisse, that would be the epiphany, that I really believe that all they needed were the facts. I mean, maybe they just didn't have them, and now they do. Is there something about having all this ability to data mine and the technology today that could be an upside for propelling equality rather than what we found this year anyway?
What do you?
Well, I just want to say how incredibly grateful I am for leaders like Rick and the CEO of PricewaterhouseCoopers, the male leaders out there. Paul Pullman of Unilever is another one who decided when he came in, I'm going for the long term, I'm going for gender and sustainability as my two levers of success. Because I believe we're moving into where it will be a license to operate, to do what I call the triple bottom line, which is profit, people, planet. And it's an equal balance.
That's a great way to look at it.
But 10 years ago, when I founded my investment firm, it was a very alienating concept. So we came together, two women initially, and then built this investment firm in the infamous year 2007. And I don't know how that sort of year resonates with you, but in Iceland it means the height of the financial bubble. Things were crazy. And some of us lost faith in this being a sustainable way of doing business. And we decided to come together and found an investment firm based on putting feminine values into finance.
So it wasn't a gender lens fund?
Yes, it was. We founded a private equity fund and wealth management and corporate advisory, so like a small investment bank in a way.
But only investing in women-owned and women?
No, not at all. And this is the point that I want to make. And this is, so I've been at this for 20 years altogether very actively, but it started really when I was 7. But I've been actively out there for 20 years talking about this and increasingly all over the world. And I honestly believe that maybe the next era or the next phase in this is, if we want to change culture, is to make this conversation less divisive. So the reason we introduced it as feminine values into finance, note, not female values, not feminist values, but feminine values into finance, is that we believe that the best leaders and the best principles at the heart of any organizations are in gender balance. So men can have feminine values, women can have masculine values. As a matter of fact, research shows that if we are able to embrace both sides well inside of us, we are going to be more effective leaders. So I'm really hoping that the next phase, and I'm always a little bit ahead of myself and the rest of the world when it comes to these ideas, but I really hope the next phase is about leadership and about what does good leadership look like. And good leadership is going to draw from both the feminine and masculine, and it's going to be available for men and women.
And you know, here in Virginia, we just had an election, and there were a lot of women like you, Halla, who had never run before, and they said, I'm running. And we weren't supposed to win many seats on the, there weren't supposed to be many turnovers for districts, because we have this gerrymandering thing, and
That's the right word.
It's another story,
but we won.
There are barriers.
11 out of the 15 winners were women.
I know.
And so, do you see this happening in a lot of places?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have to say this, and I can say this, I guess, because I'm not a citizen of this country, and it is not a political statement. I just want to be very clear of that. But some of the leadership we've seen as of late is not what I would call good leadership. And I'm not just talking about the White House. I'm also talking about some of the things that we see around the world, where we see leaders stepping up, thinking they know it all, they can do it all, they have all the answers, they are the heroes that can save us from ourselves. I don't believe or prescribe to this definition of leadership. It's not good leadership because it doesn't really empower others. Good leadership is about helping people find the leader within, which you do in your organization. Good leadership is about telling everybody, you have a reason to be here, and you have something to offer. Offer the best version of yourself to make a difference. And so I want to say that the silver lining in this cloud of not seeing good leadership is probably that we have woken up. And now we're talking about what does good leadership look like. And more women have signed up and trained and won offices. It's great news. So I'm a firm believer in us entering this new phase. It's going to take a while, and those who hold power aren't going to give it up easily. They're going to put up a decent fight. I think, yes. But I don't think that should ever be a reason for us not to offer ourselves up for leadership and to do it truly from those values from within. And so each one of us, and my message to any of you, especially you young people, and especially you who are coming from all these different countries and can change, do it as you. Don't let anybody else tell you that you need to learn leadership from those who defined it decades ago and got it wrong.
And as important as it is to listen. Listen to her. Now, Rick, this is not foreign to you because it's preaching
You
to the
do
choir
it,
in a way.
yeah.
But do you think that your fellow male CEOs see what Halla clearly sees? And I think we're beginning to intuit that this is going to happen. There's going to be a greater feminine leadership in the economy and politics, and we're on the verge of it at this low point. What is your reaction?
Yes, I do think it's happening, but that's the concern. It's not happening fast enough. It is just not happening. And again, you've got to bifurcate the world between the higher GDP markets of the world and the rest of the world. In the emerging markets of the world, it's not happening hardly at all on that. And we have got to find, that's why we'll get into this discussion, well, how do you make it happen faster in these markets? And it's interesting, we're talking about women when they get into those roles. Well, what happens? A Bain study. Bain basically found that when recruiting people in, male and female, they had about the same attitude coming in as who would make it to the C-suite. Within 2 years, women dropped 50% on her belief that she'd make it to C-suite. Why? And that's even in established markets of the world, high GDP markets. Why? Number one reason, the good old boy network, he felt supported, he felt sponsored, and she felt alone mostly, which comes up to an interesting sidebar issue that, and Sheryl Sandberg and I have had this conversation, that women have got to work on. We have held, gosh, Eleanor, we've held them in Italy and Paris, and Eleanor's head of global women's initiatives for Tupperware brands, but over the years, women's forums, 25 women at a time, 5 days. And what we find out, generally, most women in the 30 to 45-year-old bracket haven't been really brought up in business to support one another. Whereas he would have a support network, she wouldn't have a support network. And we started sitting there saying, you got to start helping each other here. I mean, I was the only guy, and they would see me 4 days commit CEO time to there, so this mattered. And we started to walk or talk about procedures so women could start really helping one another rather than competing.
Right. Well, you referenced the age of 7, because I also think you have to be sort of a special person, because not in Tupperware, but in many corporations, it's not your imagination that you're not getting supported, that the other women think, well, there are only a few of us. If I help her, what does that mean for, there's a zero-sum game thing happening. And you have to be a special person. What happened to you at 7?
Well, I mean, I asked so my mom is normally, unlike me, she was very good in the household, and she would normally bake a lot. I can't bake to save my life. My husband is a chef, that's how I saved my life.
It is good.
But honestly, she wasn't doing anything that day, and she was one of 8 sisters and 2 brothers, and they were all gathering in the home, and the husbands were supposed to be cleaning up, the brothers and the husbands. And the women weren't doing anything. So I asked her, but she was too busy talking. They were on a strike. There was sort of the spirit in my house before going into the city. And my mom's sister answered when I asked, why are you on the strike? And she answered with a simple sentence that I've never forgotten, but I fully didn't understand the power of it until later. And that was, because we want to show that we matter. And you know what? They showed. In a big way. Nothing worked that day. And I decided that day that I would matter. I'm not sure I understood what it meant, but I decided that day. And it's so important for each one of us to think that way. To not think that the solutions come from somebody else, but to think, I can matter. I can make this society, this world, the way I want it to be.
I think Title IX did that
for women in America. And the young women probably don't even know what that means, but I grew up cheering from the sidelines by design because there was no sports program for the women, for the girls in school. And we were there always cheering on the guys. And so the message you got from that, as many hugs as you got from your mother and your father and kudos you got for this and that, was you really weren't as good and you didn't matter as much because you couldn't be out there on the field. So I do think all of those things that say to you overtly or insidiously that you don't matter, that.
And I think there are issues we need to talk about that we don't talk about enough, Megan, to be honest. And one of them is unconscious bias. The other one is impression management or self-doubt. And maybe I can give one example of that. When I was encouraged to run for president of Iceland, my initial thought was, who am I to run for president? And I actually believe most good people, because humility tends to be a cornerstone of a good leader, would think that initially. Those who think immediately, I'm the right person for this, might have a problem.
There are some living examples.
There are some living examples. But I want to say this, because I don't think we talk enough about this. So often when we want to raise women's confidence, we try to do that by just be confident and be strong and be like a man and lower your voice and, dress in black. I'm still doing the black thing. I was trained in corporate America. And sort of, don't show your personality too much and sort of try to fit in. Don't stand out. And so I think this question is something that comes up whether you're asked to run for the school board or president or offer yourself up for the CEO suite or the board. And I struggled a lot, and I tried to sort of figure out what's my biggest doubt, in addition to this imposter syndrome, who am I, or the self-doubts. And that was actually the negative dialogue and the potential impact on my children. I worried so much about how my daughter and son, who were teenagers, would fare through what is inevitably a challenge to be, a public person and have a public life. So to me, I decided in order to get over my imposter syndrome, I first tried to figure out, why would I do this? Is there a reason? And I discovered there was a reason that was far bigger than my own ego. So how I fared throughout this campaign was not why I ran. I ran because I wanted to be part of the dialogue about the future and the principles and values I want to be at the heart of that future for my country, for my children, and for all the other children. So the reason I ran was bigger than myself. And I think that is a helpful way to get over self-doubt. Find a reason that's bigger than, your own vulnerable ego. The other thing I did was I became very clear on what my own principles for running were and what my definition of success would be. And my definition of success was not that I had to win to feel successful. And my campaign was incredibly successful because I went from being unknown to politics, having 1% in the polls 45 days before the election day, and I came in as a runner-up, and most people thought I needed another week to win. So to me, that was the numbers. That's Excel. And yes, I was proud to have not given in when everybody thought I should. Everybody asked me if I wanted to quit.
Has anyone suggested that?
Well, yes, of course. But my success definition was this. My children came through it stronger. So did I. So did my husband. And we made an impact on how the dialogue about the future of Iceland was. And we talked about the principles and values of transparency, honesty, equality, sustainability, and more care in our society. All of these things changed what happened. So success can mean so many different things. So I also want to say to you, running or offering yourself up for leadership, and so many of you here have done that repeatedly, it doesn't have to always be about winning. It can be about the how of how you do things. The how can matter so much more than the what in leadership.
Okay, so I'm going to, first of all, has anyone here thought of running for office? Who has thought of running for office? Okay. All right, so this is a great opportunity for you. So get your questions ready. We're going to open it up to you. Actually, there are people with microphones, so if anyone has a question, raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. And before we get to questions, have you ever thought of running?
Yes, it was a fleeting thought. My wife had thought of it for me more than me. But you know what?
That's a sign of a good leader.
Yeah.
When
no,
other
but
people call you.
What I want to add to what you were saying on something, because this is the global women's, and again, I want to get your help, because most of us live in the U.S. or Western Europe, and the 90% that don't, and the issues with regard are so different, and I get it that I go to a session in this country and a lot of conversation about STEM. I get that, okay? And but I will tell you, the 90% of the women that live in these emerging markets of the world, they're not going to have a chance to go to college. And I keep on my cell phone. I've had it for probably 5 years on my. I keep on, other than a picture, Susan. Looks good. Okay. Anyway, I keep a little list. This reminds me of qualities not measured by cognitive tests, because I'm out there often I'm in Kalimantan, which is Borneo, and she never had a chance to even have high school. She didn't, or in Southern Africa or these other places. Would you hire a woman who had these qualities, but she didn't have a degree? And these are the qualities not measured. Firstly, the selves. Self-discipline, self-leadership, persistence, courage, resilience, enthusiasm, reliability, empathy, civic-mindedness, endurance, resourcefulness. And so when somebody, if you went to chainofconfidence.com, you would see my wife, you'd see and hear my wife, who used to be with ABC Television, interviewing women from around the world, sometimes fourth grade education, who has 1,000 people who work for her. And what I've been so proud about, even at Davos, they started to call it the Tupperware effect, that and I kidded Mohammed Yunus. I said, why in the hell did you get the Nobel Peace Prize?
Yeah.
Anyway, and he's a good guy. Yeah. But we microfinance him, we give him a template. She goes out there, she tastes success, and when she tastes success, she feels confident. Almost like you running for office, what it did to you and what it does to the family, etc. And then when she has confidence, she has influence. And we did studies at Georgetown University on this whole impact of confidence in people. We found out that you can cultivate it, you can measure it, you can, in fact, with it, you can drive it forward, and that, interesting, confidence disempowers failure, because even when you don't become president, the effort of going through that was winning. Winning, and that's good. I just don't want to forget the other 90% on this whole dialogue on women's global leadership. We've got to start with those places too.
And what impresses me is that business is really playing a role. And I do see that evolution, particularly talking to Rick, into this three kind of pronged approach: sustainability and kind of giving back and to the globe. Do you think that businesses, you've obviously had a positive effect in third world countries and others, and we've seen with the United States pulling out of some of the environmental groups, that the CEOs of these multinationals are saying, no, we're going to continue to do it. Even if we are in America, we're going to continue to do it. Is there a moment here where maybe corporations are getting a little bit ahead of nation states on some of this stuff?
Oh, I think it happened long ago. That the world, even you saw, Europe after the Second World War, the Marshall Plan, it moved mostly socialist, and then they ran out of money in Europe. If corporations don't stand up to do some of this stuff, or we at least come up with some of the templates to engage individuals out there, I don't know where the solution is, because we've done the studies at Davos. Not going to be enough jobs to go around. The corporation, I mean, is a product of the industrial age, 1840s, okay? Biggest employer in the world. The most valuable company 50 years ago was AT&T, had 750,000 jobs. Most valuable is Apple, has 100,000 jobs. We have got to, I believe, it's our responsibility to come up with templates to, in fact, engage people. Interesting sidebar example, then I'll shut up, maybe. Uber's had its problems, but about a year ago, I'm in Orlando, Susan was out of town, and Simon Hemus, dear friend, we're going out to dinner, and I said, Simon, Italian restaurant, we're gonna drink wine. Let me see if Uber works in Orlando. Louise shows up. Not a new SUV, but a nice one. Probably 60 years old, African American, little girl sitting in the front seat. So we go to the restaurant. Almost just a little conversation. On the way back, I interviewed her. And I said, Louise, how long have you been doing this? And the little girl was gone. She said, oh, I've been doing this 6 months. I said, how do you like it? She said, fabulous. I said, what were you doing before? She said, cleaning houses. Now, the story here is about building templates. And I said, are you making more money? Much more money. And I can drop her off at school in the morning and pick her up later. And I said, what'd you have to learn? And I'm thinking of my list.
Yeah.
And I found out she had ninth grade education. She said, well, I knew how to drive. Okay. What about Orlando? Oh, I've lived here all my life. Great. How about social skills? And then she says, what do you think, honey? And I said, shut up, okay? But what happened, by the way, you want to talk about empathy too? The little girl wasn't her, I found out wasn't her daughter. It was a homeless girl she found 3 years before, and she was raising. I mean, God, I mean, so then I'm sitting there saying, make me come up with more templates to, even if the CEO of Uber was a jerk, they've got another one in now, come up with templates where I can use skills she already has. And there's not enough of them, because I always say this in Southern Africa, they think tech, the cavalry is coming. The cavalry's not coming. Okay?
Okay.
We got to find ways
You know what's coming?
to do
We're
it.
going to get some questions. What do you think, honey? Anybody have any questions? Okay. Can we get a mic over here?
Hello.
And just say your name.
Okay. I'm Leah Abseto. I'm a third year at UVA. And I have a question particularly for Mr. Goings. Is that how you say it? Okay. And obviously anyone can answer, like, if you want to. So earlier you mentioned along the lines of, like, not necessarily mentioning, like, social justice because you make a victim out of women and focus more on, like, economic opportunities. But, like, when I think social justice, I think, like, you know, thinking about the intersectionalities of gender equality, so including race, sex, gender identity, sexuality, and everything like that. So how do you incorporate that into your fight for gender equality? And could you elaborate what you meant by that?
I missed the last part of that. 2 years on a naval destroyer next to big guns. What was that? Yeah.
What part did you miss? You
The
said.
intersectionality description.
She wants to know if you can explain how you incorporate, you know, gender, race, even.
Yeah, like the intersectionalities of gender
Yeah.
issues. So, like, advocating for women of all races, class, economic backgrounds,
Yeah.
abilities, sexualities, things like that. Like, how do you incorporate that in?
I hope I understand the question the right way, but we start talking about as we grow people in our organization, again, not from the social justice side, we talk about the richness of diversity. And you start inculcating leadership as they're young, understanding these are the things that are of value. You were talking about what women bring to it. And we really start to see, because you start to look at the different skills and the different approaches, and we find out you're going to do better career-wise, and you're going to be a better person if you include these kinds of people. So we do performance appraisals somebody becomes a manager, and we start to say, how are they doing with mentoring? Who are they mentoring out there? And then we start to look at it, the diversity basis of it, not to check the U.S. guidelines on that, but because we know it's what gives us competitive advantage. And I'll tell you, we've had to change people because they wouldn't get aboard on these kinds of.
So change, it has to be kind of structural, and there needs to be a little
Oh.
infrastructure in their appraisals and their evaluations.
You try to bring them with you.
Yeah. And so there were some other questions, I think, over here. We can get a mic over here.
He's got a mic.
Oh, here we go, good.
Hello everyone, my name is Joseph, I'm from Mozambique and I'm a CSP fellow. My question is directed not only to the panelists but everybody in the room. So how would we engage youths, specifically young men and women, to run for office in a setup where violence is dominating the political sphere? Just to give you a few details about my country specifically. People who represent moral values in politics get killed, specifically when we go for elections. On the 4th of October, a town mayor from Nampula was killed in front of his gate. And right now I was reading news and I was being told that the security detail for another town mayor has been removed and there are no reasons why the security detail was removed. So when you get out to young men and women and try to mobilize them to participate in politics, the first barrier they face is this of political violence. So how do we maneuver ourselves around this barrier so that we can rise in office, and specifically women, because when you tell them about politics, the only challenge that they state to you is that they are afraid of the violence that is involved around politics. Thank you.
And even in Iceland, those women must have been afraid.
Yes. Thank you for that question. I think it's incredibly profound. And it saddens me to say that I know a female former head of state who has said in private that she regrets running because of the cost that decision has come at. And so that I emphasize with that situation, and I think it's incredibly challenging. But I think maybe if I may offer a little bit of a philosophy about what's going on here. When it comes to peace, which I think ultimately we all want, 97% of those working in peace are men. And I don't know if you know this, but peace workers rape as much as the warriors or the warring.
That's the.
I mean, it blew my mind when I learned that. So there's something incredibly wrong there. So I'm going to go with gender balance. I'm going to go with that we need to get women involved in peace and peace negotiations.
And there's actually a UN 1325, it was an order maybe 8 or 9 years ago, that there needed to be, Stephanie Foster's here, she'd know about that. Yeah, 15 years ago, but we've made very little progress.
Very
Stephanie,
little
am I right?
progress.
I think we've made no progress
And-
on 15. Very little.
But I want to add something to that. So I think it's about who's involved in peace, because I really think we need to become a lot more serious about that. This is another reason why I think it matters to have women heads of states in the Western world as well, because they get together all the time, and I really do think different issues are going to get onto the table and going to be discussed differently if we have more women heads of states and leaders in all aspects. But I'm also going to get at the heart of the business side of this, because I come from business. And I honestly think there is something incredibly wrong in a world where we are all celebrating rises in the stock market that are perhaps driven by more production of military equipment. You know, so there's a commercial side of this, there's a peace side of this. So I could get very political on this, but I actually think that all of us need to start thinking really seriously. And we have a country called Norway that has a very big oil fund called the Norwegian Oil Fund that is starting to negatively screen out those who produce and sell weapons. And I actually think this is coming. So I think there's a commercial side to this. Last but not least, I want to cite the case of Rwanda, because Rwanda is on the top 10 list. It's 40-something places ahead of America on the list when it comes to closing the gender gap. And it was what I would call a sisterhood. And to me, that made that happen, what happened in Rwanda, and ended incredibly challenging times and changed everything for that country. I know there are still challenges, but everything changed. And they did it with sisterhood. And just so I'm clear, sisterhood, unlike brotherhood, can include men.
Inclusive.
It's inclusive. And I actually have a lot of honorary sisters who are men like Rick.
Yeah.
I hope he will become one now that we've met.
Yeah.
Who are men who really think this is not about women. It is about win for all of us. So I think if we can create more sisterhood-like organizations that support and truly support those who are willing to risk offering themselves up for leadership and risking their human security along with it, that would be helpful.
Let me weigh into this too. One of the wonderful women that's on our board was Kathy Bertini. Kathy was Under Secretary General of the UN, she was in charge of all security. We've had many discussions on this, and this is in parallel what you're talking about. This just isn't a staffing thing, although that is a huge problem. There is a commercial side of this. I mean, interesting, it was probably 30 years ago, Jacques Attali used to have to go through his office to get to Mitterrand, and he wrote a book called Millennium and the Change in Order. But one of the things he talked about was one of the number 1 or 2 things we would be dealing with in this new millennium is violence. And he said it was going to be mostly driven by the gap between have and have-nots. Yeah. Okay? You cannot go online if you want to see something interesting. If the world were 100 people, it'll take you 3 minutes to watch it. You will be shocked to see the lack of balance, not only gender balance, but just with regard to resources in the world. It basically depicts one person has half the money, but go take a look at it. But it gets down to the point that we've got to figure out ways for peace. It isn't going to be solved just by governments. We did a study with the Global Fairness Initiative. We funded it. We did it in Mexico, and we did it in Indonesia. And we wanted to see the impact if you put her in a structure, a template. We even said, so her husband wouldn't beat her. In a world where 1 out of 3 women is abused sometime in her life, what we found out is if she was engaged with us for 3 years, she went from, firstly, thinking I'm not good enough to I am good enough, and 1/3 even said, I'm a leader. Second, she became connected to other women. And when women are connected, they're stronger, and they won't put up with some of this crap. Okay, she stops it, okay? Third, she moved from lower class to middle class. And lastly, her husband went from abusing her to helping her.
And seeing her as an asset.
Yeah, and it goes back, and you don't solve it on one front, this whole thing of violence. When she becomes respected, you treat her differently.
Now, I want to talk about this idea of the gender lens funds that are, my husband's in Congress and he's head of this thing called the Men for Women Caucus. Yeah. And one of the things he's been pushing is trying to allow
How many people are in that? Because I heard there's 150 in wine and 20 in decency.
I think they need more wine in the he for she, or the Men for Women Caucus.
Yeah.
I think it's something like 12, because he's trying to build
Maybe it needs to be men for wine and women.
He'd like to try to get it evenly, so he's trying to build one Democrat, one Republican.
Good.
It's a little hard to do that, but he's going to do it. But one of the things they're promoting is this idea of letting federal workers allocate a part of their 401k to a gender lens mutual fund, like the one Joe Keefe has, the PACS fund that he has. And someday this may happen. But the thinking behind that is, if you have a fund that rewards companies like Tupperware that have met this threshold of women in the C-suites, that we could, through the way the market is supposed to work, people would be investing in companies that are going to make more money because they have women in their C-suites, but you're also encouraging other companies to do the same. Is there much evidence that that's working?
Well, it's interesting that 3% of the institutional capital in this country, last time I checked, goes to women managers and
3%.
And men of ethnic, not of white descent. So it's 2.7% actually to be exact. So it's less than 3%, which is crazy because half of it approximately is at least soon going to be owned by women, approximately. Right. So the institutional funds are our pension funds.
California has already done this. California has
some of them have started these gender lens funds, but it's kind of to what one of these ladies whose name I can't pronounce, but is sitting there in the beautiful orange, thank you, said this morning, that sometimes we build barriers. So because I started a fund, or in our company, we started this first fund that invested with a gender lens probably in the world as a private equity fund. It was a $30 million fund, which is not very big, but at the time it was very foreign. And we invested on sort of 3 levels: in women who either own their companies, women where, we have gender balanced management, or where you have products that appeal particularly to the female market. And we outperformed, at least at the time. We were the only fund, and our company was the only one that survived Iceland's economic meltdown. So after that, I started looking at this, and women who managed hedge funds, they outperform. Yeah. And I don't think that is because women are better than men at doing this. I think it is because the ones who make it through all the barriers, they are so incredibly good that you would be wise to choose them to manage your money. It's something to think about. So we see now there are about 50 of them in the world now. In 10 years, a lot has happened who use gender lens in some way. And I think we need more time before we really know how they perform. But money talks. And I went into finance not because of my interest in that sector, which I frankly felt and still feel is rather soulless. I went in there because I thought it was worthwhile to try to build an organizational DNA unlike the rest of the sector and see if that resonated with people, and it turned out to do so.
Well, I do think there's great hope in that, and Rick talking about how, the inequity in the world, and just intuitively to me, it feels like democratic governments should really be embracing this idea of equality globally. And that maybe we're seeing companies and multinationals that are based in democratic countries doing that, but I can't say that right now I'm feeling this great sense of trying to export these values of equality from some of the big democratic countries right now. Do you have any insight?
Yeah, do you know what? I would have, 20 years ago, before I lived in China, in Europe and elsewhere, I would have given much more power to a political ideology or structure. I don't right now. I will we had our president of our Chinese business, which is a very big business for us. And they've done a wonderful job, by the way, with regard to starting with the Gang of Four of women having influential roles. As a matter of fact, speaking at the Beijing, honey, you remember this Beijing Business School, which is a premier business school, their greatest problem is it's merit entrance, and 80% of the students are women. So they said, well, how are we going to get some men in here? But here's the point I'm getting to.
Meritocracy.
China, look at China 30 years ago, and look at India 30 years ago. India's pretty much where it was. And look at what's happened to China since then. Now there are more billionaires in China. And yeah, you'll say it's communist. Well, it's actually kind of a socialist, but so I get away from the political labels of it. All I can tell you is there were 850 poor people in China who couldn't eat 20 years ago, and I see these cities changing. Shanghai's it's just incredible what they're doing. So I'm in favor of using whatever means possible for a political structure. Yes, you didn't have to go through the Cultural Revolution. There were some millions killed there, but that wasn't on Deng Xiaoping's watch or the government today. It isn't our system, but let me tell you, the system is working. India's still not working. We've been in India the same amount of time. Too much democracy. Too much democracy, so you can't get any template that you can scale up in India because every neighborhood wants to do a different thing. And then we sit there and look at the populist elections in Latin America. Let's take Venezuela, largest oil reserves in the world. Look what's happening in Venezuela. Start picking them. So it is not so much the political system. You generally need to be able to figure out a model that works for individuals and scale it up. And I'm still searching to find out where that works with culture the right way.
And it might have to work differently in every culture.
It does.
Well, I would like to go out on a limb here and say that because I come from the Nordic region, and say that I think we have figured out a pretty good model of living in
From here,
Scandinavia.
it looks like it. Tell us.
No, I mean, honestly, if you think about it, so we used to be called, I lived in the US for 10 years, and I did my education here and worked in corporate America, so I have some experience of both worlds. And so I feel like I can say with some certainty that we are more inclusive as societies. We have a higher work participation of both men and women than most other countries. We have built infrastructure to allow us to also have families. We don't have the same enormous wage spreads between the highest paid and the lowest paid, and we are the happiest nations in the world. And I think that should be measured. I'm a great big proponent of measuring happiness and not just GDP. And I think just like in companies, just looking at GDP, we need to look at social progress and
Gallup
happiness
has
and
a
wellness.
Well-being.
So I think the Nordics and the Chinese, interestingly, I've only had one sort of official visit there, but they kept saying to me, the CEO of the chamber, when I was in that role, and I met him in Shanghai, he kept saying, we want to be harmonious societies like the Nordics. So I don't know if they are copying the Nordic way of living, but they believe that harmony matters. And now this is the limb, really. I feel that today, because I lived here for so long, that I'm coming back as I visit today to America that is so divided. And I don't think America can be strong again so divided. I think united you will be. And so I really do think that there's something about that social deal that has broken. And it's being responded to not in a way to unite us, but in a way to divide us further in this country. And in many other countries, unfortunately. And so politics aside, I do believe that we are only sustainable if we can all become the best version of ourselves.
So, implicit in all this is change. I mean, I think we all recognize that the World Economic Forum shows that we're going back, not forward. If we have discussed today how women have this eye for sustainability, for sustaining the environment, for adding to the wealth of experience and a different point of view in our leadership.
And changing the definition of success.
And that is changing the definition of success. Tell me your definition.
Well, to me, my definition, because this question came this morning, I can already feel yours, but to me, my definition of, and I love it, but my definition of success is being able to go through life and work and live in line with my authentic values and myself. Whatever I do, if I'm an entrepreneur, investor, or leader in business, or I'm running for president, it's about being true to yourself and your real values and principles. And I think that's also what leadership is all about.
Okay, I've got to read.
Also good
It's almost like we just met, but I keep in my pocket what our purpose is and our values are. And this almost sounds like okay? Because
Can I run for president of Tupperware?
Yeah.
Is it possible?
Okay.
I think you have as many people as my country.
The purpose, why we exist, to inspire women to cultivate the confidence they need to enrich their lives, nourish their families, and fuel communities around the world. And one other thing I've read, because then it gets to, and how we'll do this, to ignite a global community, especially women, to realize their best selves through opportunity, enrichment, celebration, and above all, uplifting relationships.
Ah, I love it.
So you just said that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We are
Very
Tupperware.
You just said that.
When is your presidential election?
Yeah. It's not an election. Yeah.
Okay, no more questions? Okay, one more. Am I running out of time? How am I doing?
Have about 5 minutes.
Okay, good.
Let's take a couple of.
Okay, let's take a couple more questions.
So this was not my original question, which I will get to in a few seconds, but I wanted to push back against the idea that India hasn't changed in 30 years as someone who spent many years of my life in India. That is absolutely not true. Unlike other countries, India's current defense minister and foreign minister are women. We've actually had a woman prime minister, unlike this country. But
Keep going.
But what I really wanted to say was build on the first question on the idea of intersectionality, because diversity is an idea that I'm increasingly uncomfortable with, because it's something that exists to make corporations and universities feel good about themselves and to tell everyone about how many women they have. And that doesn't help me. I don't want to be someone's diversity hire. I want women to be, women deserve to be everywhere. We deserve to be the president, we deserve to be on the boards of communities, and especially when organizations emphasize diversity in the hiring of women, what that usually means in this country is hiring white women, and women of color are always erased and left out of the conversation in the United States. And so I think that is something that you simply cannot ignore, and you just cannot say that, oh, let's ignore social justice and tell companies they need to hire women. I don't think that works for most women.
I love your passion for it. I might add that we started a program about, how many years ago did the Department of State ask us to go to Iraq?
It was in 2011.
2011. So we go to Iraq. This leads to India. And they said, all these women, Colin Powell, who's been such a support to me over the years, he always said the Bed Bath & Beyond, if you break it, you own it. And that's clearly what we've done with Iraq. And they wanted us to look at what could we do for women. So we created a program called Global Links that we had a whole room full of bright young women getting out of school. They didn't know how to start businesses or what to do. So we said, we'll create a learn and return program. And then the next place we did it was India, and we've done it now twice with India. And I'm very hopeful. The young people coming out of India, their brains, their passion, their heart is just incredible. The infrastructure is the blockage there. And you have 1.3 billion people. It's harder to do. It's the reason that why now, remember Ericsson and Nokia? Remember, they did telephones. And then what happened is Steve came up with the iPhone. By one approval by the FCC, he could have a market of over 350 million people. In Europe, you needed 46 different approvals to sell a smartphone. And therefore, all of a sudden, they're gobbled up and they can't compete anymore. That's kind of the infrastructure problem in India. Whereas China, they smooth it for the people who want to scale up businesses. So I'm hopeful, but it's going to take a long time.
Do you want to respond to that at all?
I don't have my microphone.
Oh.
But so democracies are messy. The United States is messy. We have a messy democracy, but in the long run, I'm still hopeful enough to believe that democracy will win out, and an inclusive multicultural democracy is more sustainable in the long run. And not everything is about making it easy for businesses. It's also about, I have a lot of problems with the democratic system in India. I can't vote in India because I'm a US citizen. But I don't believe that everything should be set up to make life easy for businesses. It's also about what is best for the citizens, and citizens are who can best speak up for ourselves. It's not a bunch of bureaucrats like they have in China. China is a great country. I have many friends from China, but you cannot run a country with a bunch of unelected bureaucrats. That's just not sustainable in the long run. And I think you should also look at what best benefits the women of the country.
And do you know of any
No
programs
argument.
now that you would want to tell us about in India for women?
No.
Oh, okay.
I'm an astrophysicist. This is not my
Well, good for you.
I'm impressed by that. But it's very important to say to what you raised earlier, it's not about the numbers, it's about making the numbers count. What I mean by that is, and we've been too focused on the numbers, I think, when it comes to women in leadership. and not focused enough on, that's why I talk more about principles or values, because it really is about building inclusive cultures. That can never be just about what sex we are. It has to be about building a culture where everybody can really bring out themselves, their authentic self, and really do well, whoever they are.
On that note, thank you, Halla.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
You're refreshing, thank you.
No,
This
thank
was
you.
really
It was
nice.
so nice
This was
talking.
fun.